Hello again. In this session, we're going to look at how the concepts of what once constituted news and media have been transformed over the last decade or so. We'll discuss how the opportunities offered by new technologies and new literacies have not only changed the way we consume information, but changed the way we think about and conceive of news and general knowledge. As a result of the latest technologies since the advent of the internet, traditional boundaries have blurred in the mediascape. I'm talking about the boundaries between objectivity and subjectivity, journalism and writing, between sources and audiences, and between information and entertainment. There are a number of commentators who continually complain that the news today is too entertainment focused, that there isn't enough space for serious news. I'd argue that people of all ages are getting news, it's just that it's not the news as it used to be. The contemporary mediascape has been referred to as network journalism, and remember that network refers to traffic that's not just one way. So a networked practice of producing, editing, forwarding, sharing and debating. It's been referred to as media work, as intermediation, as mediamorphosis, and as hybridisation. For those who are interested in further reading, you can see in the current slide the scholars who are linked to these terms that I've just mentioned. Now, if we think about social media, as we've seen throughout this module, it showcases possibilities for mass participation and collaborative work. In other words, social media harnesses collective intelligence, increasing general participation as more people take part. The entities we've been talking about so far, YouTube, Twitter and Facebook to name the big ones, are media platforms. They have been, and often unwittingly, applying themselves to the traditional structures of newsmaking. So they're not replacing journalism or journalists, but what they are doing is questioning the conventions of traditional news and current affairs, including how such conventions may constrain what and who is regarded as newsworthy. For example, one thing networked digital media do is redefine how the story is told. In one well-known example, during the 2004 Indonesian tsunami, many people looking online for news were directed to blogs for the latest and sometimes the only updated information. The social phenomenon of citizen journalists became significant in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, the London bombings and the Boxing Day tsunami in Indonesia. The eyewitness reports of ordinary people recast the conventions of the mainstream news coverage. For example, when the London bombings took place, instead of relying on journalists, news agencies around the world relied on witnesses from the general public for photos and videos, mostly taken on mobile phones. Traditional media are in decline for a number of reasons, not only because of the advent of the internet. The market has found a way to diversify through new forms of media, challenging the long-standing control in Australia of Fairfax, Murdoch and Packer. In a keynote address at a media conference in Sydney a few years ago, US media academic and blogger Jay Rosen argued that traditional journalists and major news companies should stop expecting open platforms, like blogging and Twitter, to behave like traditional production systems. He said, people who come from closed systems see chaos, but they need to see that open systems work differently. If journalists can detach what they do from the medium, from the system their work runs on, they can see that having more participants creates a better news system, he told the conference. But the issues facing traditional news and journalism are not only about the business of media, they're also concerned with the ideals of the fourth estate. Before I expand on that, you may ask, what is the fourth estate? The expression originated in the 18th century, and it's used to describe the press's role in society, the idea that the press keeps tabs on those in power. The other three estates are the church, the judiciary and the government. You may well raise your eyebrows at this idea, and it's something we can come back to in class. So the core ideals of the fourth estate are objectivity and balance, quality control, ethical considerations and fact-checking. So there's an argument to be put that rather than undermining traditional journalism, the changes to the mediascape are returning journalism to its radical and democratic roots, recreating a public domain that was killed off over the 20th century by the concentration of media ownership in Australia. Firstly, the importance of objectivity is probably the core journalistic ideal, most often cited by those who believe quality journalism is dying. Yet one could argue that every decision a journalist makes, not to mention someone in PR, advertising, any sort of communications work, you could argue that every decision is subjective. Who and who not to interview, which questions to ask, which quotes to include, how much background information to use in a story. In the past, when you worked for a mainstream publication, you had to stick to standard frameworks and patterns. But in previous decades, there were some journalists who decided that the conventional forms and methods of news journalism didn't work for them, and they turned to literary reportage, also known as creative non-fiction, and in doing so broke new ground. I'm talking about George Orwell, Hunter S. Thompson, Norman Mailer, and Joan Didion, amongst others, whose collective work has illustrated how subjectivity can be a route to knowledge and understanding. Second ideal is quality control and ethics. If we value credibility and analysis, aren't we seeing more of these? It's true that we have access to much more bad writing and questionable journalism, but I also think there's much more analysis and news generally available now. The issue here, it seems to me, is access, not lack of material. When it comes to ethics, I don't see how people who call themselves journalists can claim to conduct themselves more ethically than their peers or anyone else in society. Naturally, journalists should aim for high ethical standards at all times, but this of course isn't to say that they all do. The last issue is fact-checking. As I've said, it seems to me that there's a wider variety of sources of news today than there ever has been. As well as the ability to link to primary sources, journalistic processes are now more transparent. True, with the demand for 24-hour news, mistakes of course happen. The speed in which news is expected and delivered means this is more and more likely. But there's also more scope for editing and corrections. In addition to professional journalism, amateur and citizen journalists provide opportunities via links for readers to source background material, and so readers can make up their own minds. So we no longer necessarily have to wait for the Sydney Morning Herald or the Daily Telegraph, for example, to get their experts to interpret things for us. In other words, as I've suggested, the loss of power for certain people who had become accustomed to having a bit of power may have led to some of these issues. I must add, I'm not trying to tell you how it is here. I'm giving you food for thought. You're welcome to debate any of the points I've raised during the tutorial, and I'll see you soon.